Let's start with France's announcement about these sanctions on people and companies over their links to Syria's chemical weapons program. Are sanctions enough to stop the kind of horrific chemical weapons attacks that we've seen on civilians?
Well, they're not enough, but they're an important step forward. I mean, as your correspondent just said, there was very clear evidence that the Assad government was responsible for a sarin attack in the town of Khan Sheikhoun this past April. And that was covered up, of course. That was one of a series of 4 nerve agent attacks that Syrian forces committed just in the prior months, according to research that Human Rights Watch was able to do. The so-called Joint Investigative Mechanism, which is the UN body, was on the process to coming up with the same findings when Russia basically vetoed its extension, covering up for Assad. And it should be no real surprise that, that sends a signal of impunity, and therefore there's evidence that Assad is continuing chemical weapons attacks, this time presumably with chlorine, in the besieged enclave of eastern Ghouta, where 390,000 civilians currently are in the process of starving to death. So ideally, we would have prosecution and justice, but pending that, certainly sanctioning the responsible individuals is a very important way of signaling that the international community is not with Putin on this. We do not want to give a green light to the continued gassing of Syrian civilians.
Ken, you're speaking to us now from Davos, perhaps the world's most iconic display of globalization driven by the rich and the famous. Is there room for a discussion on human rights there in Davos as well?
Oh, there absolutely is. In fact, I think you're aware that Donald Trump will be delivering an address on Friday. And in fact, I'm moderating a major panel just in the hour after Trump, where we are discussing global human rights. And indeed, there is lots of interest, not only in the real crises situations like Syria or Yemen, or for that matter, Myanmar's ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, but there's also real interest in sort of how do you fight back against populism, against the autocratic governance that people like Trump represent. 2 of the big speakers in Davos this year are Trump and also the Indian Prime Minister Modi, who spoke this morning. And Modi, talked about the Indian economic miracle, but didn't talk about his promotion of so-called Hindu nationalism, which is a very intolerant political strain that really targets Muslims. I suspect Trump's going to do the same thing. He's going to talk about how America's economy is flourishing, but he's going to not mention, the racism, the misogyny, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia that are essential parts of his appeal to his base in the United States. There's going to be pushback in Davos because even though it's called the World Economic Forum, in fact, people come here to discuss a whole range of political issues, and the dominant value here is one of tolerance, not the kind of intolerance that we see people like Modi and Trump promoting.
Well, how likely is it, or are you worried that perhaps Trump's presence, Modi's presence on these issues might lend support to their policies, like, for example, in Donald Trump's case, the travel ban, and might he be able to convince those he meets of similar things?
I think there is zero chance of Trump convincing anybody here that he should be discriminating against Muslims in who gets to enter the United States. And frankly, this is why it's important that President Emmanuel Macron of France or Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada are also speaking here. Hopefully, they will be delivering a very forceful message of the importance of tolerance, of inclusion, of building democracy on respect for rights, not the kind of populism that basically demonizes certain disfavored minorities. When you allow that kind of demonization to take place, in the extreme, you get something like what Myanmar has done to the Rohingya, basically forcibly displacing 688,000 people in the course of just a few months.
Ken, I just want to wrap up on a positive note. In the new Human Rights Watch report, you say that the biggest turning point last year was here in France with the win of President Emmanuel Macron. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, a year ago, I think many of us were in despair. It looked as if the populists were on the ascendancy and there was no stopping them. But a real turning point in the last year was the electoral campaign led by President Macron, because, rather than trying to present himself as sort of the far right light and kind of inching up to the far right, he did just the opposite. He vigorously supported democratic principles and showed that it's possible to persuade the French people to overwhelmingly back his program over the more exclusionary, intolerant program of the National Front. And we've seen similar pushback in a range of countries, including the United States, including, Poland, Hungary, Venezuela, places where, the populists are in power at the moment, but there's real resistance. And what we've seen over the last year is that when you have that resistance, it's possible to limit the damage that the populists do.
Ken Roth, thank you so much. That's the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Kenneth Roth speaking to me there from the World Economic Forum in Davos. Thank you.